story to tell. Joseph Stalin was a heavy tank series developed by the Soviet Union during World War II. The JS-3 began to be developed in late 1944 and could only be used on small scale during the campaign against the Japanese army in Manchuria. Although it was a failed design, the JS-3 also made an important contribution, forcing the US to develop a similar heavy tank, the M103. However, this tank was no better than its rival. Beginning to be put into the payroll in 1957, the M103 was the heaviest tank the US had ever built before M1 Abram appeared. At that time, the weight of 60 tons of M103 was a huge number, when most other tanks were only 40 to 50 tons. The power of the engine was not commensurate with this weight. This made the tank move very slowly. The range was limited. In fact, when M103 was born, heavy tanks became obsolete. Many countries have switched to using main battle tanks. Only 300 M103s were ever built and never participated in combat. By 1974, all M103 had been withdrawn from the payroll. In World War II, the US military never had a heavy tank capable of coping with German heavy tanks like the 60-ton Tiger, which had a bigger gun and thicker armor. The Germans and Soviets both employ heavy tanks as breakthrough vehicles, which traded speed for heavier armament and armor to enable them to penetrate fortified lines. The British had the Churchill, a heavy but slow infantry support tank to help riflemen get through German trenches. The United States was the exception. The only operational tank in Europe at that time, the M26 Pershing, was not even heavy enough to fulfill its missions. Prior to World War II, a tank weighing 30 tons or more was regarded as heavy. But by the early post-war period, medium tanks had reached 45 to 50 tons, and heavy tanks weighing over 70 tons were being considered. After the end of the war, the Soviet heavy tanks became the new threat, as these were designed to deal with the very same tanks, and now were antagonized to their former allies. The IS-3 and IS-4 series have in common a strong frontal armor, sloped and 180mm thick, and a 122mm gun as a standard. The British had a 64-ton Conqueror with a 120mm gun, and even the French had the AMX-50 heavy tank. The US Army experimented after 1945 with various heavy tank designs. But spurred by growing Cold War tensions, the Army opted to push an untested design, the T-43 heavy tank armed with a 120mm gun, into production. The solution was to modify the T-43 into a new vehicle called the M103, the first operational American heavy tank since the Mark 8. Like the contemporary British Conqueror tank, the M103 was designed to counter Soviet heavy tanks, such as the later IS series tanks or the T-10, if a conflict with the Soviets broke out. Its long-range 120mm cannon was designed to hit enemy tanks at extreme distances. Following contemporary American design philosophy, the M103 was built with a two-piece cast elliptic armor scheme, similar to the M40's design. The new hull that could save weight while being optimized at all angles for maximum sloping effectiveness, saving thickness and therefore weight. The driver was placed in the center line of the bow, allowing better glacis designs. It featured 7 road wheels per side, mounted with long-arm independent torsion bars. The 28-inch track was short in steel-back rubber chevron tracks. The Continental AV1790 engine was placed at the rear of the tank and produced a maximum output of 810 horsepower, fed through a General Motors CD854 two-speed transmission. This allowed the 60 heavy tank to achieve a maximum road speed of 34 km per hour and a maximum climbing gradient of 60%. The resulting performance of the tank was dismal, being severely underpowered and very fuel-intensive. This presented a host of logistical problems for the vehicle, most prominently the extremely limited range of just 130 km. Though this was partially corrected with the introduction of the AV1790 2-diesel unit, it could remain cumbersome and fuel-thirsty for the majority of its service life. The hull was made of welded cold RHA steel plates and partly cast. The cast brake was 99 to 130 mm at the thickest. The driver sat at the middle with a small rounded one-piece hatch above him and 3 vision blocks covering the frontal arc. He had access to 2 consoles, one for the basic performances indicator and another for the engine situation. The driver's module, along with the generator and accessory box, was placed in the middle, under the main gun axis. The turret was very large to house the recoil mechanism and absorb its course, and cast as the M48 and M60 turrets. It was also quite thick, with 249mm on the mainlet, 280mm on the turret front, 76mm on the side, and 38mm on top. The configuration was not standard, with the gunner at the right-hand side, the loader on the left-hand side, and the commander in the middle behind the gun, with his own rotated M11 cupola and an adjustable seat, which was placed high in the turret buster. The commander was also responsible for the VHS-1 transmitter and 2 separate receivers housed also in the buster. Of course, no NBC protection was offered. The M103 was designed to mount the 120mm M58 gun, using standard armor-piercing ballistic cap tracer rounds. In its configuration, this gun was able to score hits at 2,500 to 3,500 meters with good accuracy. The commander could select from the 34 rounds of either M358 armor-piercing ballistic cap tracer rounds or M469 hit shells mounted at the rear of the turret and in the hull. With both loaders, the maximum fire rate of the gun was 5 rounds per minute, owning the design with the 2-piece ammunition. Using the electro-hydraulic turret traverse, the gunner could turn the turret at 18 degrees per second, with 15 degrees of elevation and 8 degrees of gun depression. Secondary armament comprised the twin coaxial mount for caliber 30 with 5,250 rounds installed, the usual M2 caliber 50 on the roof at the extreme rear of the turret. The US M103 heavy tank entered service in the US Army in 1957. 300 were built. 220 vehicles were standardized after modifications for the USMC as the M103A1, and the US Army requested 72 tanks from the USMC stocks that were sent to Europe and attacked to the 899 Heavy Tank Battalion of the 7th US Army. Interestingly, the Germans had found that while they didn't lose many heavy tanks in combat, they abandoned a lot more during retreats. Towing a broken down 70-ton King Tiger from the battlefield was no easy task. Faced with the prospect of an overwhelming Soviet armor assault, the 7th Army had every reason to want a heavy tank that could survive a retreat as well as an advance. Nonetheless, the M103 still suffered from traditional heavy tank problems. It was found that the engine was underpowered, requiring replacement of engines and transmissions after average mileage distances of only about 500. The ammunition storage was not convenient. Repeated firing of AP ammunition caused excess chamber erosion. Tracks were easily thrown. Crew safety, comfort, and ability to function were impaired by poor interior arrangement. But even with its flaws, the M103 was still useful. Although it was felt that the tank was sluggish, it could do the job intended. During the service in Europe, the heavy gun tanks were well liked by their crews. The troops recognized that the powerful 120mm gun was far superior in penetration performance to the 90mm cannon of the medium tanks. Finally, in 1972, the Marines retired the M103 and ended up with the M60, and that was the end of America's heavy tank experiment. It was the same issues that has eliminated heavy tanks around the world. M103 was completely withdrawn from service in 1974. Post-World War II armies have shifted to the main battle tank concept, in which a single model is expected to fulfill the breakthrough functions of a heavy tank while retaining the mobility of medium and light tanks. The M103 was the last American heavy tank in inventory, and 25 are preserved to this day in many locations in USA, and a single one at Bovington, United Kingdom. My video of M103 heavy tank ends here. Thank you for watching. If you find this video interesting, please give me your thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye, see you again in the next videos.